This is what you want. This is what you get. This is what you want.
You have located GeekFest Rants, the entertainment podcast for genre geeks like you.
Shall we play a game?
Covering the world of vintage and current film and television since 2010.
Game over, man. It's game over.
Featuring in-depth conversations on sci-fi, horror, fantasy, comics, toys, and conventions.
So say we all. So say we all.
And now sit back, relax, and enjoy today's show.
Neo Tokyo is about to explode. Streamlined Pictures presents a state-of-the-art adventure, Akira.
Hi, everybody, and welcome once again to GeekFest Rant. My name is Carlos Perone, and joining me, I have Steve this time around. He is here to help me tackle one of the landmark films in the genre of anime, Akira. Now, we've briefly mentioned this film once before, but this time around, we're hitting it straight head-on with Steve, who is a big, gigantic fan of this particular film. So, let's get started.
What did I teach you?
You are the Duke of New York. You're a number one.
You will not laugh. You will not cry. You will learn by the numbers. I will teach you.
Can you dig it?
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
That spawn of Satan.
Oh, really?
The Force will be with you, always.
All right, as I said before, we're going to have Steve here. Hi, Steve. How are you?
Hey, Carlos. Hey, everyone.
Well, we are going to hit a topic that a long time ago, I hit it with someone else, but it was pretty broad in terms of we did I believe we did a special on anime, but it was like a general anime to kind of, it was almost like a 101, like basics of anime. We didn't go deep into anyone and we didn't go into one specific movie. We kind of did a very broad, stroke at anime. And one of the ones we did mention was Akira, because Akira is, one of those pillars of, I guess, most of the stuff that nowadays we could see, and it's being even influenced, across, the sea. In other words, we're being influenced by Japanese films, and our influence kind of jumps back and goes back and forth. But this is one of those big ones. Tell me, Steve, how did you either hear of this or got involved with this movie or anything like that? This is a long time ago. This is 88.
Oh, yeah. This is, I was all of 1 year old when this came out. So, but I obviously heard about it, when I was much older. And I heard the name tossed around, but I was never, maybe back around middle school, I started getting more into anime and, Japanese animation. But I was never really too into it. But I would just hear the name Akira thrown around, but I never really gravitated to it. I'd always be watching like Gundam Wing or something more action oriented,
right?
Something that was on TV a lot. So when I heard about it, I just sort of heard about it and then never sort of actually committed to watching it. And it wasn't until like a few years after that, and back until I believe my early years in high school was when I sat down and watched it. And my first reaction to it was, what is it? Like, what am I watching? Because it was so different than any of the other anime I had previously watched. And it had a different tone to it, a different feel to it. And that's to say, also, just to preface this, I'm not really a huge fan of the genre of anime to begin with. And I don't believe you are as well. So, and how did you first come about it?
Well, when I used to go to conventions in the late 80s and I guess even early 90s at some point, anime in general was always there. And you had these tables full, completely packed with VHS tapes, and I would look at them and I'm like, I have no clue what this stuff is. I'm moving on to the next table. But the poster for Akira and the name Akira and copies of those VHS tapes were always there. But at that point, I wasn't really ready to take a dive into exactly what anime was. I would say probably in college, that's when I probably started kind of dabbling with anime, especially with, and then we talked about this before, the Laserdisc market. The Laserdisc market was before DVDs, before Blu-ray and all that stuff. It was kind of like the film snob format of being able to watch movies, watch them in widescreen, trying to argue with people about pan and scan versus widescreen and all that stuff, and going to Blockbuster and telling people, don't pick up that. You got to get the widescreen one. And the people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Get out of here, kid. That kind of stuff. But this was one of those movies that, in the list of, well, if you're into laser discs, you got to try this. This is from Japan. I was like, ooh, what is this? And yeah, by the time I saw it, I was older. And a couple of things struck me from the movie that I kind of recognized that I might have seen somewhere else, or at least it might have some influence. Because a lot of times I always hear about how Akira influenced a lot of stuff that we see now, or even in the last 20 years, which is true. It did influence a lot of stuff. But I always, for whatever reason, I always thought everything came from Akira. So I'm thinking, oh, Blade Runner, this is like Blade Runner. Look at the streets, look at the city. It's like, wait a minute, Blade Runner was 82. This is 88. This is the other way around. So that was one of the things that I always kind of stuck. It's like, it's got some Blade Runner in it. It's got some weird visuals that I can only attribute them to Blade Runner. The other thing was those motorcycles, especially the Hero motorcycle. Oh, yeah. That thing is just amazing. And the only other time I've seen such fancy futuristic motorcycles is Tron. So again, I'm going back to 1982 again. And it's like, okay, maybe there was a little bit. I know there's a scene in the beginning where the motorcycles, I guess it's at night, and they're leaving a trail behind of their light.
The light,
so I know it's not a real trail, but it's got that Tron trail look thing to it. And it's obviously it's supposed to be the flare of the light. So I those type of things, I kept coming back to me. But this is, like you said on your initial reaction, this movie is a little strange, which let's try to see if we can kind of talk about the plot. And one of the things I find in general, let me just say this, when you're dealing with foreign films are different in more ways than just the language. There's a different pace to certain foreign films. The humor is different. The acting is different. Now, granted, this is animation, so this is even weirder because you're not dealing with live subjects. But one of the things I notice with Japanese films, whether it's a Godzilla film or a more modern film, even like a Yakuza film or even something like this, complete science fiction, there is this prominent theme in one way or the other of nuclear war or the effects of nuclear war or something related to nuclear war, which is something that I think culturally has been kind of stuck with Japanese films, which, how could you blame them? That's part of their culture. They got to experience it firsthand. And, whether it's Godzilla coming to destroy your city, who's powered by radiation, the atomic power radiation, or something like this that is completely like crazy sci-fi, world building and having all these powers and manifesting and destroying completely, entire cities and killing a lot of people. I kind of see that. But let's try to figure out the story. What would you say the story is?
Also, just on first time watching this, I had no idea what the story was. It wasn't until later on where I sort of, okay, I can see, in perspective. So basically, the first beginning of the movie is very quickly set in 1988, actually. Yeah. And from the first scene, you see a nuclear bomb go off in the middle of the city. So that right there sets the tone of, okay, I see where this is going. So, and then once you see this, silent very heavy scene of this, a bomb exploding in the middle of a city. It jumps forward about until actually our time period right now, the 2019, oddly enough. Mm-hmm. And so Tokyo itself, the city has been completely wiped out. It's now been replaced by like this sort of fringe city called Neo Tokyo. Yeah. And you can even describe Akira as being sort of a dystopian future, really, because it has a very dark dystopian feel to it, where there's like civil unrest everywhere. The opening scene of this movie pretty much sums it all up, the setting, because you see there's like this civil riot going on between like these protesters and like the government itself.
But it's not the type of dystopian where it's like Mad Max type of it's very organized, and it's they recovered from whatever happened, but things are still not exactly right. The crime is insane.
Something feels off about the time period. Like there's something where it's not like civilization's wiped out and like there's no lawlessness everywhere. It's still a city, it's still a government, but it feels like a sort of like tangential sort of history of what would happen if a society was sort of wiped out, taken out by something as devastating as an atomic bomb, and how they would react to it. And you can definitely make the case where this is sort of, I guess, as you stated before, where Japan has like this sort of fearful respect, I think, for technology and weaponry and bombings and everything, as opposed to a lot of the media that we have here, where a lot of the science fiction of the time was more based on, how great, like Star Trek, these big ships, and it was very optimistic.
Very optimistic.
It seems like, and like Star Wars, it seems like with here, especially with this movie, where it's the complete opposite, where technology in this world is it's almost frowned upon. You can think of it as it just seems it has a very dark overtone to it. So yeah, so this movie definitely has a different tone and a different like view of technology. So there's sort of like street gangs. And again, the opening scene is just pretty much setting the scene where you have a whole bunch of younger kids. They're sort of a rebellious state against sort of a
gangs.
Sort
of
gangs. And I mean, even people who aren't in the gangs, you see like these riots kind of breaking out in the streets. So that's the general setting of it. And now the story itself focuses more on a specific gang, and there's about 3 or 4 main characters that you would follow. And the main character is Kaneda, and he's this rebellious kid, sort of a very angsty, and he has his friend Tetsuo. And his friend is a bit more of just want to say, is more of a follower. He kind of is more subservient to Kaneda, but they're played upon each other as they're good friends. Tetsuo is trying to prove himself in this biker gang, so he does some sort of like crazy chase sequence where there's another rival gang and they sort of fight each other. And Tetsuo gets into a bike accident. He crashes his bike into this kid who appears in the middle of the street.
Right.
And you see, this big explosion, and Tetsuo is basically thrown from the bike. Kaneda and his other friends catch up with him. They try to help him up, to see if he's okay. And you see there's a scene where all these like military helicopters come in. They land, they surround the kids, and they take Tetsuo, who's injured because of the accident. They take him on board, and they basically take him, say, screw off kids, and they basically take him away.
Right.
And so you don't see Tetsuo again for a bit. The movie then focuses on Kaneda and how, what happened to Tetsuo. And everyone's pretty confused. They don't know what's going on. So it comes about that the government sort of had like these crazy experiments on Tetsuo, and they sort of put him into this program with these other kids who are even younger than him.
They're younger, but they look very old, and their flesh tone is like very dark, like very like gray green, and it's like they look like little zombie old men or something. They're weird looking.
Yeah, the kids who are also part of this government program, you can tell like they're young, but stature wise, and they come off as children, but like you said, their skin is wrinkled and pruned, and they have like these like grayed hair and everything, so you can tell they've either been experimented on to a point where they stress their body to complete old age almost.
But they're capable of kind of communicating and kind of leaving their environment and interacting with certain people I guess without the government knowing. They're kind of, I wouldn't say completely free, but they're kind of poking their head out there to see what's going on.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, the government is obviously experimenting on these kids, and so each one of them sort of manifests these sort of different powers, but they are sort of, I don't know if they're hiding it or they have like some sort of extra ability where they can sort of, if they wanted to, sort of go beyond what the government is trying to, limit them to.
Right.
Basically, it comes down to one character who's like this colonel in the army, and he's trying to sort of harness their power to sort of either use it as a weapon or just at least just harness it so that they could, like, I guess, use it in some sort of military capacity. And basically, they want to incorporate Tetsuo. They also have like this sort of reference to a fourth child who would have been known as Akira, and hence the name of the movie. And Akira is supposed to be this sort of deity, sort of Deus Ex Machina type character who is. And this is where you can get really, you would have to watch this movie to really see what I'm talking about. But the visuals in the movie are very, very striking. They have very like sort of cyberpunk / fantasy. It's a very hard movie to pin down. But basically, the colonel would want to sort of wake up Akira, so to speak, because he's this sort of dormant child who's been buried underneath Japan, basically, sort of hidden away. And the colonel would want to sort of reawaken Akira to unlock its sort of power.
And they also mix a lot of the cultural, I guess, at the time or even now, you could see, sometimes you see like foreign news reports and you do see like these religious, I don't know if the religious cults or religious groups that they kind of cling on to other stuff and like the riots, and they're talking about terrorists, and they're talking about, not being able to control the crowds and that kind of thing, and how these groups, all of a sudden, they kind of join something else, and they're like part of another group. Even with the military and the soldiers, how they, like the guy you were just talking about, how at one point, he even betrays his own bosses and goes on his mission on his own. It's like, it's different. It's different. We're not used to seeing it in that, played out in that manner.
Yeah, and it's a good point you bring up, because the whole like theme of that, I've watched this movie a lot, and the whole theme is just everything is crumbling. Like you see there's many shots in this movie about like, you see like the crumbling buildings of like the old Tokyo. You see like the infrastructure is crumbling, the government itself is crumbling. Like there's many scenes of the colonel who's gathered with, it's not their Congress, but it's sort of like their parliament type.
It's like a committee that's in charge of something.
But that's like, they have like their sort of like finance officer and everyone's sort of bickering and fighting with each other. So like that's like crumbling. The lower levels of the city itself are in disarray. The characters themselves, even the main character, the main cast of characters are not like nice kids, and they're not like cute people you want to really hang out with.
No, like even when the movie starts, like the two gangs, and I know that like the clown gang, they're the real nasty ones. But even Canada's gang, it's like they're a bunch of lowlives. They're all a bunch of lowlives.
They're all
the girls that are hanging out with them, they're a bunch of lowlives just like them. It's like, I don't know. It's hard to. And again, I don't know if it's a cultural thing or you're meant to not like them, but I couldn't connect with any of the characters like, oh, he's the good guy. Little by little, Canada becomes the good guy in a way, because that's the closest thing to a good guy, because he's the one trying to help his friend and stop the craziness that's happening. Because the movie kind of turned, I mean, if you want to be really brief about what's this movie about, it's a monster that's growing out of control. It's the Frankenstein monster, really. It's at first it's contained and very little, and he still has his humanity, but little by little he loses his humanity and he goes wacko. He goes out of control.
Yeah, and to put it into I guess an analogy, I guess would be if you've seen the movie Chronicle recently, or something like Brightburn.
Oh, I saw Brightburn.
Yeah. It's when you put in something like that, that's sort of the summary of what the gist at least of what the movie, the main plot of the movie at least. Yes. And I think even as weird as anime gets, I think even back then in the 80s, anime then wasn't even this like out there and weird. Like
this is the beginning. This is the
time.
beginning. This is the start.
Yeah, definitely. Because even at the time, this movie was looked at as like, wow, this is.
But it grabs,
really
like I said, it grabs a little of everything. You know, like I said, I could see at least with the settings and the set design. I mean, granted, it's animation, but set design. I see so much of Blade Runner in this. And it's like the snake eating its own tail, because again, Blade Runner is supposed to look like Tokyo at night, and this movie is Japan, you know, and a lot of it at night. So it's which came first, I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's all the same thing, you know. It's really weird.
And just to let everyone know, this is also based off a manga as well, like a very thick, huge manga. So
did that come out before Blade Runner?
That came out in I have it here. That came out in I actually have the copy.
There you go.
It says copyright 1982.
So we're still good with Blade Runner.
Yeah. So it's also a movie that's obviously adapted from the manga. So, and the manga is some 2,000 pages. So it's huge. So there's a ton they had to cut from the movie. Like reading the manga, a lot of it doesn't even make its way into the movie at all. So much of it is just tossed away.
Does it make more sense, or is it just more of this crazy all over the place type of stuff? It's a lot
more of the craziness, but there are things that sort of go into a lot more detail with like Kanada's personal life and like his relationship with Tetsuo. That gets, and his relationship with his other friends. That gets really dived into a lot deeper. And the whole resistance too, like they have like the whole this resistance movement basically that's sort of trying to go against the
experiments and the government. And
the very totalitarian government, and that gets fleshed out in the manga.
One of the things that this reminded me of, and obviously some other things came later, when I finally read Watchmen and how the end of Watchmen goes completely berserk crazy with the big giant monster thing. This kind of reminded me of that. It's like, how crazier can you get? I mean, this is it's a whole other world. You're dealing with a completely different way of demonstrating, the powers of this thing.
Yeah, that's actually what I really like about the movies, where it starts out very like small, about a small group of kids basically, and from there the movie just like a balloon, it just kind of like expands outward, and you start out with like just a 4 random punks basically, and from there the story like spirals out until by the end of the movie literally it's about the end of the world and some sort of monster baby mutation. So I really enjoy the way the scope of the movie changes from very micro out into the more macro level film.
Now I don't know what kind of rating system they use in Japan, or at least used in this time, but this is a hard R kind of film at certain scenes.
It's like a horror movie, like
there's like a Superman type of film where you theoretically hundreds of thousands of people die because of these gigantic explosions that take out buildings and whatever. But there's also some like kind of creepy, weird stuff. There was a scene where the gangs are they're assaulting like a girl. And all of a sudden, there's like a topless shot, and they punch her, stuff like it's like, ooh, this feels kind of weird for this kind of film. But it's again, this isn't Disney. This is not. These are not supposed to be for little kids, I assume. So, this is a more adult material. And I think that same girl, if I'm thinking right, she gets killed later in the movie in a horrific way that I'm like, holy crap, they did that.
Yeah, and it sort of takes you, but it took me by surprise as well, because I'm watching it and I was like, oh wow, I thought it would be some sort of maybe like it was like implied or something. No, like it was completely out there.
It's like there it is. Or are they going to kind of have her come back because everything's okay at the end? No, that she's toast.
And even not in the way of any sort of sexuality, but there's one shot where after the government has. I shouldn't say government, I should say military, because there's two different.
It's a little confusing.
After the military captures Tetsuo, they put him in like sort of like this testing hospital, really. And there's one scene where he breaks out, and he's sort of like his powers are sort of manifesting, and he breaks out of his room, and there's these doctors around him trying to calm him down. And there's this scene where he like sort of like amps up his powers, where he like shreds the doctors apart.
Yeah, he shatters everybody to little tiny pieces
into like chunks of meat, and you see it all like falling from the ceiling and everything, and it's all animated just so fluidly and graphically. It really is something like. It sets its tone and the stage for other anime to come down the road, which, for better or for worse, again, for me, my relationship with anime is like, it's so much of it is just so over the top and crazy, and too much of it is just so, like, oh, let's draw, let's do this for the shock value.
But it's a different culture, and even forget a film, but just anime in general, from what I understand, the standards for anime are very, very broad and loose in terms of sexual material and violence. That's something, it's nothing new. That's just the way these things have been for a while. And I don't know exactly how it all started, because I know they, like, for example, those type of things, those type of subjects, obviously our experience is whatever we see here. So we judge everything based on our standard. Right, and for example, from what I said, in England, they're much more open about sexual subjects, but they kind of pull back more, especially in the past, in violence. They don't like to show too much violence, but they're okay with more sexual tones. Japan, on the other hand, they like both at the same time. They don't have the kind of restrictions that we have. Granted, we've changed quite a bit in the last 20, 30 years as to what we like to show on a regular film. But anime, from what I understand, has always had, not so much anime, but manga had that thing where it's like, whoa, this isn't for kids. This is something else.
Yeah, it sort of seems, and I could be off base on this, but it seems like anime itself was sort of like because Japan for so long had been, especially after the heels of World War II and, going to the 60s, where it sort of like was more reclusive and pulled itself back. It seemed like in the 80s, and especially when it came to like manufacturing, and where they were becoming a lot more sort of the center of the manufacturing world at one point. It seemed like they had this like cultural sort of rebirth, really, and they were becoming more exposed, and more outward with their, I guess, sexuality and violence and everything. And it seemed like it sort of spawned around like the 1980s.
But yeah, because it's weird, because here in the States, from what I understand, sexual themes and that kind of thing kind of exploded in the 60s, when you had the the hippies and feminism and all that stuff. That's what kind of loosened the reins on you watching a 1950s I Love Lucy, and then you have Easy Rider and stuff like that. There's a big difference between those two kind of things. But with Japan, I've always thought of Japan as a very repressed. You could say part of it might be the government and part of it might be the people. They just like that, quiet. We don't like to talk about these things. This is private, that kind of. But then when did it happen that everything kind of went off in that manner? Like you're saying, was it the 80s? Is that when what caused it? Was it the all of a sudden the influx of money coming into the country that people were like, okay, here's what I've been thinking about all this time. I'm going to show you exactly what I've been thinking about. It could be, because a lot of times that's a lot of those things happen, that where you have certain cultures that are stereotypically very repressed in terms of, well, they don't do this or they don't talk about that. But guess what? Behind the scenes, that's exactly what they're doing, just like everybody else. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know exactly where that took place.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the good things. I guess one of the things from anime, I guess, that can be taken away. It seems like that's like an outlet for a lot of like their more repressed, normal day-to-day social lives, where it can come out in their artwork and everything, in the art forms and everything. So I guess that's one of the side, and from someone who I really, really enjoyed this movie and the manga. I guess that's something that's sort of like can be considered a good thing, where it sort of is someone obviously who would feel more repressed and not as easy to open up in their social lives. They'd be able to express this in a sort of more artistic way.
Right. Because, I mean, I don't know, like, for example, music in Japan, I don't know if, you could kind of say here, we have so many different types of music styles. And again, things like sexuality and even violence, it is represented in music, the way certain people present themselves and the type of things they sing about. I don't know if Japan is the same. I don't know if they also express themselves artistically through music, with these subjects, or is it more isolated to a visual mean?
One of the things I forgot to mention actually about the original manga, where you mentioned is some sort of differences between the manga and the anime. The manga also delves heavily into drugs. There's references of it in the movie because if the main gang of Akira, if you notice, they wear jackets.
He's got a pill in the back.
Pill. Yeah, has a pill.
Oh, yeah.
Has a capsule. And their biker gang is actually called the Capsules. But drugs and this sort of like hallucinogenic stories are heavily into the manga. And it comes and goes into the anime. You don't really see it's not really focused on. You see like one scene in the beginning where he takes some pills, where he asks the bartender, do you have any pills?
That's right, yeah. And even later on when he goes into the bartender, he's asking them for, I thought he said clappers or something like some weird
capsules.
Capsules, yeah. Now the other thing is that we were talking about earlier. There's always been chatter of turning this into a live action American film.
Oh yeah. It's been going on for quite some time.
Yeah, and one of the names that I remember hearing was Keanu Reeves, because again, he's coming off of The Matrix and all that stuff, and again, the snake is eating its own tail. The Matrix. It goes back to Japan, and it comes back to us, and it goes back to Blade Runner, and it comes back to us, it goes back to Akira. I know it's an easy name to kind of throw around there as a possibility, but
especially recently.
And we did mention Watchmen. How this? I remember everybody. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of the whole Watchmen phenomenon, but I do remember everybody always saying this movie's impossible. You cannot make this movie. You cannot take this comic book and turn it into a movie. It's completely impossible. Do you think this film can have that same problem? First of all, you have to rewrite, again, for American audiences, you have to rewrite this to shreds, because I don't think you can go into so many of those different places that you did in this movie. Is it conceivable that you could turn this into a movie?
I think it would face now another challenge, because first, I think making this huge volume and this book into an anime itself was a challenge. Making it into one movie was one animated movie was already a big challenge.
Are you saying this should be a miniseries? Is that what you're saying? It should be a Netflix or an HBO?
It should be a Netflix 12-part miniseries.
Visually, there's no problem. We've seen, what was that movie we talked about last year?
Ghost in the Shell.
We know this is conceivable. You can do it visually. The question is, can you turn the story into something that American audiences would understand and accept?
I was getting to that. I think so. Now, I think so. I think if you would have said this maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I would say, no, it's not going to. They're not ready for it. I think now, though, that this sort of story and this sort of setting has sort of been seen now before. It's been more of accepted, like with The Matrix, Ghost in the Shell, Chronicle. Like the whole cyberpunk sort of dystopian future has been introduced already. So I don't think it's that hard of a sell to introduce now to audiences. Now, rather you can adapt it well, and rather it will flow as well as the anime did. That's something else. I'm not sure if you can squeeze as much into a live action movie like this as you could with the anime. I'm not sure why. I feel like the anime had an easier time squeezing this much content into the movie as opposed to live action. I think it might be a bit harder to do and to get mainstream audiences to buy into it as well.
Well, yeah, I would imagine for a typical 2-hour movie, you would have to strip away a lot of the extra characters, a lot of the governmental different groups that are kind of fighting amongst themselves. This would have to be, the young gang member who's running with the bad boys who for whatever reason wants to do the right thing now, whether it's a girl or whether it's his friend or whatever it is that makes him want to go straight. And then you throw in the big, like I said earlier, the Frankenstein monster, his friend that all of a sudden is exposed to some kind of weird genetic thing that turns him into this monster ravaging the city. And then this, like a Godzilla thing where the government, the army can't stop him. It's up to his friend, and the friendship is what, love conquers all type of thing. That's what I imagine they would do with something like this, because I think they would completely strip away all of the cultural Japanese things that we see, taking place in the movie.
Yeah, I think they would, and unfortunately, I think that would sort of neuter the movie. It would sort of take away the main theme of that I feel is very intrinsic to the movie. And just to touch upon this as well, another big factor in this movie that I really love is the music. The music here sort of plays like a second part to this movie, and it's done by a group called the Yamashita Gumi, and it's sort of like 80s synth / Indonesian tribalistic
That's
beats.
weird.
Like it's a weird mashup, but like I have the soundtrack. I bought the CDs, the vinyl, and I have the whole soundtrack downloaded. It's probably one of my favorite soundtracks. Aside from the great Star Wars, this is probably one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. Because it adds like this very like earthy vibe to it, and it's like it blends the technology with the more human elemental aspect to it. It's very, very unique.
What about, do you have any collectibles, any merchandise having to do with this film?
There is a McFarlane set of toys.
Is it the motorcycle and
the motorcycle and Canada himself?
Yep,
yeah.
I got those. I got them they're in the garage somewhere.
I have Canada here, but I never got the bike. I was hunting for the bike, but then I lost interest. I was like, I'll sell every so often. I'll like.
That's funny. I don't remember buying them individually. I thought they came in a set.
No, I'm pretty sure they're individual because I think Canada and Tetsuo come together, but the bike is literally the bike is literally separate. The bike is its own package.
I only have those two. I have Canada and the bike. I don't have Tetsuo at all. That's weird.
Unless maybe they were re-released. Maybe they switched the release.
Sometimes they do individuals, and sometimes they package together. So it's possible they went that way.
I've only seen the bike by itself. Like it's weird. It's like just a bicycle, in a blister. It's a very iconic.
Yeah. He's got the most futuristic of all the gang member bikes. The other ones are more like modern, Yamaha, that kind of stuff.
They're very like the character design is very like so stereotypical what you would think of in the 80s, sort of like that, like cyberpunk, like the cutoff jackets and sort of like
but it's weird because I know I remember seeing a piece in the news about Japan and how they have these like rockabilly biker gangs, and it's like Japanese kids that like to dress up as 50s American kids in bikes, and it's like, how does that work? And they're listening to like Elvis. It's like, what? I don't get that. It's so strange how certain things stick and certain things don't.
Yeah, we have like a whole bunch of things from Japan like we love over here. And, kids over there are like, oh, okay, whatever.
What's wrong with these people?
yeah. But yes, so like it all comes together to be like such a creepy, disturbing movie. Really, like the artwork and the animation itself should be noted as well. The animation here is, I think, today still holds up.
Oh yeah, and the action sequences are so clear. They're not just jumbled messes. They're clear. It's cinematic how these things. It's like you're watching a Marvel film, like some of these buildings exploding and things toppling over and that kind of stuff.
In my earlier reviews of it, like I just wanted to like really note the fact that how like animated everything is. Like if you really look at it, you'll always see something like as this camera is like on one, seemingly, one frame that's kind of like, not a lot of motion going on. There's still like small little bits of detail sort of in the background. Like if one of the scenes that stands out is when the colonel sits down on a sofa, something very mundane. The sofa, like the cushioning around him sort of is pressed in, and it's things like this that the motion in the movie, like the animation is so fluid, and everything appears to be always moving. It's the attention to detail is just amazing.
And
so
we
really still holds up.
Yeah, we hadn't seen back in '88 or in the early '90s. We hadn't seen something like that yet. This was brand new. It's almost like watching a John Woo film for the first time in the '90s. You're like, wait a minute, this is different. There's something good here. I'm not sure what it is, but it's different. And this is what happened with this film. It was like all of a sudden, it's like, oh, this is how we have to do this now. And everybody kind of started copying, I think, this particular style. Now, did they ever make any sort of sequel to this story?
No, the manga ended in 1990. So it lasted only a few years after the movie, but I don't think it really continued. It basically finished where the movie ended, basically. So it wasn't, so it wasn't anything like a continuation of the story or anything like that. And that's another thing I really like about this is the fact that it was never like, as much as I love Star Wars and I love Star Trek, but a lot of times franchises get dragged on, past the message that was supposed to be intended in the beginning. And I love Star Wars to death, but it's sometimes like the original movie, the original intent is sort of stretched out, past how it was actually intended. With Akira, it seemed like it wanted to say something, it said it, and that was it. There was no need to go back to like, oh, well, what happens after the mutant, after Tetsuo, evolves? No, it's just it said its piece and it finished from there. So, which is something I really appreciate.
Well, at this point, I guess we like you said, we're probably not going to see any sort of sequel, whether coming from Japan or even America. But something tells me sooner or later they are going to adapt it, and who knows what direction that will go because.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's going to be a more mainstream movie, a more mainstream, sort of action, hero versus big bad type,
big monster
type movie. Yeah.
Well, Steve, thank you again for coming in and helping us with this one, because this one, I know it's one of the ones you suggested, but it was like, this is it's a landmark film, and it does have, some background to it that, it didn't just come out of nowhere. And I would say to this day, it's still influential enough that, we kind of still see this popping up in modern anime.
Yeah, and not even in modern anime. There's references to it, and or it's just sort of themes and overarching storylines that still pop up. So it's definitely not only contained to anime anymore. It's definitely been the zeitgeist, so to speak, has been sort of felt outside of it.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Steve.
Hey, no, thank you, Carlos. Take care, everyone.
Well, just as we were pretty much done putting this show to bed, around that time, news came down, and this was a number of weeks ago. This was probably around the time of Comic-Con, probably around the time of the announcement of the Marvel slate during Comic-Con, that Taika Waititi had dropped out, or at least they were putting on hold, any plans on him directing Akira. Now, yes, Akira had been going around many times before, and we talked a little bit about it during the show, how Keanu Reeves at one point was attached to it. Well, apparently, more recently, Warner Brothers had tried once again to try to revive and to adapt this particular film. Apparently, back in 2011, director Jean Collet-Serra, not sure what the track record of this director was or is, Warner Brothers had looked into the possibility of having this director take it and go in a completely different direction, and instead of making it a very Tokyo Japanese kind of story, that Neo-Tokyo setting, instead making it in the US, which kind of goes a little bit in the direction of what we were just talking about, of trying to Americanize this film. This is back in 2011, so obviously a lot of things have happened since then as far as other films that have come out. But what's really unusual is the fact that at some point Waititi was involved in reviving this particular film and trying to make a new version of it. And what's a little strange about it is that because he has been coming off of mainly comedies, which is his staple, especially with the Thor Ragnarok, which was this huge, hit, all of a sudden, making the Thor movies even more exciting than before, having the feeling that sooner or later he was going to do something else Marvel related, most likely. He was also a potential candidate to maybe do some of the Guardian films, when James Gunn was kind of taking off those projects, even though now he's kind of back on the project. But he would have been a perfect candidate, to tackle Guardians in case, they were still looking for somebody, but obviously not anymore. But yeah, he apparently at one point got attached to Akira, which leads us to think about, well, how would that have worked? In other words, Akira is not a comedy, and if this guy's strength, at least now, is comedy, I don't see how they could have adapted it and what tone this movie would have taken. This is like a hard R kind of movie, as far as I'm concerned. Unless this was going to be his serious film, his attempt at a very, very serious film. So it comes as no surprise that because, he is now going to direct the next Thor film, following up to his own Thor film, that this is now being put on the shelf. I believe the official word from Warner Brothers is that it's being put on hold. I don't know if he necessarily completely has exited the project or what, but it kind of brings us back to this whole thing of this is one of these projects that just, cannot seem to get off the ground in as far as a live action version of it. I mean, obviously, Japan could make their own version of this movie. Nothing's stopping them from doing it, unless it's a rights issue. I don't know. The fact that Warner Brothers seems to have the rights to do it, I don't know if that's part of the thing. But yeah, it's not incredibly shocking that all of a sudden, poor Akira is back on the shelf again. Well, I'd like to thank Steve once again for joining me today and helping me go through this film, because it is not an easy film to go through. It is very adult as far as I'm concerned, even though it's anime. And anime, for people that are not familiar with anime, they could just dismiss it as it's a cartoon, it's animation. No. We talked about this once before when we did our basic, our introduction to anime. Anime is a completely different art form. Some is for kids. Yes, there are some very kid-ish kind of versions of it, but the big, heavy hitters are adult. This is a medium that is used for adult kind of subject matters. And in the world of specifically science fiction, man, these guys go deep, and, they earn their R rating a lot of times, when it gets translated, for American audiences. So thanks for listening, and we will see you guys soon here at GeekFest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Akira! Akira! Akira!
Akira!
If you would like to subscribe to our show, send us messages, or see video links to some of the topics we talked about today, please visit our homepage at geekfestrants.com, or our YouTube channel, Facebook page, or iTunes at GeekFest Rants.
I don't know what we're yelling about!
GeekFest Rants is produced by Carlos Perón, copyright 2019.
This broadcast is part of the IC Robots Radio Network. Visit icrobots.com for this and many other nerd/nostalgia related podcasts. You won't be sorry for long.